Recordings in progress. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to come speak tonight. I'm going to talk a bit about the Stones River campaign. That's the topic of our discussion. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself a little bit. I am Dan Masters. I am a native of Northwestern Ohio. Please do not hold that against me. I live in Perrysburg, Ohio, with my wife Amy and four of our six children. Our oldest son is currently serving in the Air Force down at Eglin in Florida. Has been in now, this is his sixth year. Our oldest daughter just graduated from nursing school. She's a labor and delivery nurse at Toledo. And then we've got four more got one in high school, one in junior high, one in middle school, and one in grade school. And at four different schools, it's been kind of a crazy year. I was a graduate of the University of Toledo, class of 2002. My degree is actually in communications. I have never worked a day in that field. I've spent 30 plus years now in manufacturing, and I'm currently working as a global planning manager for the Materion Corporation, which is located in Elmore, Ohio. Obviously, that's enough to keep me busy most of the time, but really what gets me up every day in the morning is the study of the American Civil War, which I've been passionately doing for more than a quarter century. Kind of came by it honestly. I'm the descendant of five Union veterans of the Civil War, three of whom served in the Army of the Cumberland. One could say that the Army of the Cumberland during the war was the family business. Probably best known either for Hell by the Acre, which was an award-winning book we released last year about Stones River, or my blog, Dan Masters Civil War Chronicles. So quite prolific. I think I have over 1,050 blog posts in the last 8 years. So lots of good content out there. A lot of good content about Michigan as well. So my personal connection to the Battle of Stones River really what kind of prompted my journey into studying the war in general. Really, my interest in the Civil War was sparked in the course of doing genealogy and finding out we actually had family that were in the war. We've got a picture. I only have a picture of one of them, but this is him. This is my closest Civil War ancestor, my great-great-grandfather, James Parker Brown. If you can see on the photograph, he's very proudly wearing his Grand Army of the Republic medal. He served for 4 years in Company D of the 37th Indiana Infantry with his brother, Francis Marion Brown, and managed to survive the whole war without, he was sick a lot. He was in and out of the hospital a lot, but he was never wounded, never injured. But he was at Stones River and fighting on some of the most hard-fought ground of the entire battle. But he lived to tell the tale. The second image is obviously my third great-grandfather, James Morrow, is in that picture somewhere. What that is a drawing of is the 1st Ohio Cavalry conducting their hell-bent for leather cavalry charge on the first day of the Battle of Stones River. In the course of them making this charge, you can actually go on the ground where it occurred, but you might have to dodge a few houses and cars in the interim. But they were attempting to save General McCook's wagon train from Confederate cavalry. And the 1st Ohio Cav charged into that, and their Colonel Minor Milliken was killed basically within eyesight of my great-great-grandfather. So he was there when that occurred. So obviously the Stones River story was pretty important to him. And the third connection is a little more tragic. This is a stone that belonged to my fourth great uncle. His name was James McClargan. If you see the computer screen, you'll see that it says Joseph McClargan. He was buried under the wrong name, but he was James McClargan, and he served in Company C of the 21st Ohio Infantry. He served for about a year and a half until at the Battle of Stones River, he was mortally wounded in the head. And we know that he died in Nashville, but we don't exactly know when he died because the records give 3 different dates. He either died January 11th, January 20th, or June 20th. And thinking a head wound, probably one of the January dates would make a little more sense. But it was the discovery that we had all these connections to the Battle of Stones River that really lit the fires for me, I'd say probably around 2001 or 2002, to really start studying this battle in depth. So, brief overview of the Stones River campaign. It is one of the bloodiest engagements of the war. It is the second bloodiest in the Western theater. It was fought between December 30th, 1862 and January 3rd, 1863, near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Murfreesboro today is practically a suburb of Nashville. It's about 25 or 30 miles southeast of Nashville. But as I said, as one of the most rapidly growing areas of the United States, the two cities are almost turning into one at this point. There were more than 81,000 men of both armies that participated in the battle, and in the course of the engagement, over 25,000 of them became casualties, almost one out of three. The Stones River campaign marked the third major engagement between the two primary armies that fought it. There was the Federal Army of the Cumberland under William S. Rosecrans and the Confederate Army of Tennessee under Braxton Bragg. These armies had clashed for the first time in a major way back during the Battle of Shiloh, particularly on April 7th, 1862. And then again, kind of at the climax of Bragg's Kentucky campaign at the Battle of Perryville on October 8th, 1862. Kind of common themes for all of these engagements. They were all very hard fought engagements. The casualties tended to be quite high. At Shiloh, I think there was something on the order of 23,000 casualties over those 2 days. Perryville, which was a relatively short engagement, lasted maybe 5 hours, and the two armies inflicted 7,500 casualties on each other in that short amount of time. The character of these armies, they were mostly Western, what they considered then Western men, basically people who lived west of the Appalachian Mountains, tended to be a little more self-sufficient, shall we say, than troops from the East, but they also tended to fight quite hard. So really, when these two armies got together, it was usually a bloodbath. Or a slobber knocker, as they would call it in wrestling parlance. When they clashed, it was a bad day for everybody. The two commanders of the armies were Braxton Bragg, who is the gentleman, I guess that would be on the left, William S. Rosecrans commanding the Federal Army on the right. Stones River was the first of three campaigns these two generals would wage against one another between December 1862 and September 1863. There was Stones River. About 6 months later, there was something called the Tullahoma campaign, where Rosecrans was able to kind of nudge Bragg out of Tennessee almost entirely, and with very, very few casualties. And then the third campaign was the one that culminated in the 3-day Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. Important to note that the goal of each one of these campaigns was the control of Middle Tennessee and primarily Chattanooga, which was the gateway to the Confederate heartland. So, kind of the general facts of Stones River. I've got a little thing I'd like to read here, and then we'll move on to really the mission statement of the book I wrote. But the waning days of 1862 marked a nadir in the fortunes of the Union. After major defeats at Fredericksburg in Virginia and Chickasaw Bayou in Mississippi, it fell to Major General William S. Rosecrans and his Army of the Cumberland to secure a victory that would give military teeth to the Emancipation Proclamation that was set to take effect on January 1st, 1863. On the day after Christmas, Rosecrans moved his army southeast out of Nashville to Murfreesboro, met Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, and fought one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the war. The opposing armies, 44,000 men under General Rosecrans and 37,000 under Bragg, locked bayonets on December 31st, 1862, and some of the hardest fighting of the war. Bragg's initial attack drove the Federals back nearly 3 miles, captured 29 cannons, and thousands of prisoners. Somehow, the Union lines held firm during the critical fighting along the Nashville Pike that afternoon against repeated determined attacks that left both armies bloody and exhausted. The decisive moment of the battle came 2 days later, when in the fading afternoon light of January 2nd, 1863, Bragg launched an assault on an isolated Union division on the eastern bank of Stones River. Once again, the Confederates enjoyed initial success, only to be repulsed by 58 Union cannons right along the west bank of the river in a daring counterattack. This repulse broke Bragg's hold on Murfreesboro, and he retreated the following night, leaving Rosecrans and his Federal Army victors of the field. Now, these facts I've given you have been written about by other authors. The Battle of Stones River has not had a ton of scholarly work, but it's had a few books written about it. Probably most notable was Peter Cousins' book that came out in the late 1980s. Larry Daniels also put out a book about 10 or 15 years ago. That said, after reading those books and having studied the battle as long as I had, those works kind of left a little. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more what the soldier experience was at this battle, and those books really, they were all about 200 pages, and the Stones River campaign really lasted over the span of a couple of weeks. To tell that whole story within 200 pages, you gotta consolidate a lot. So those details that I was really interested in weren't there. In the course of doing the research for the book, of course, read Sam Watkins' memoir, Company H, or A Sideshow, The Big Show. And he had served the entire war in the 1st Tennessee Infantry, which, of course, was at Stones River. Actually, Sam Watkins suffered his first war wound at Stones River, Murfreesboro, as he called it. But in his memoir early on, he writes that the histories of the Civil War were all written out by the big bugs, generals, and renowned historians, but he declared that he had as much right as anyone to pen a history. And in his intro, he writes, I propose to tell of the fellows who did the shooting and the killing, the fortifying and the ditching, the sweeping of the streets, the drilling, standing guard, and who drew the ramrod and tore the cartridge. So while prior studies focused on more we'll call a top-down approach to describing this campaign, my goal was to kind of complement those studies by re-examining the campaign from the ground up. What did the soldiers on the ground experience, and how does that change our perception of how this battle developed? Sam Watkins' statement where he proposes to tell the fellows who did the shooting really resonated for me. That I read that and I'm like, that's exactly what I want this book to be about. I want the soldiers to tell this story from their perspective, not from General Rosecrans' perspective or General Bragg's. What were the guys in the field actually experiencing? What they have to say about this event? So that became the mission statement for the battle. It really helped kind of ground my writing as I would go through. It's like, why am I doing this, and what's the perspective that we want to present? So that said, there's as you read through the text, you'll notice that there is more of a focus on what the company level officers and enlisted men had to say about various aspects of the engagement. Kind of the way I illustrate that is this particular image is of Colonel Samuel Beatty's brigade going into action about midday on December 31st. And obviously, prior studies would tell you what Beatty's brigade did. If you're lucky, I might even have told you a little bit about what this particular regiment was doing, which was the 19th Ohio Infantry. And if they did that, they might have shared some of Colonel Beatty's experiences or descriptions in his official report. Maybe if you're lucky, there might have been something in there from Major Manderson, who was commanding the regiment. But there was not too many of them that touched on what Corporal Henry Clay Elston experienced during this battle. And that really became what I wanted the focus to be. This is not a micro history. You're not going to find out Company A did this and Company B did that. But what you're going to find is that the individual soldiers had quite the story to tell about what their experiences were of combat. So that said, there are a couple of stories I'd like to share with you. These are a couple of my favorites drawn from the book. The first one's a little bit more on the ridiculous side. The next one's a little more tragic. But the first one is it was penned by Lieutenant William Odie. And William Odie was serving in the Signal Corps of the Army of Tennessee. The Signal Corps was a very, very new development. Of course, the Signal Corps, as it existed during the Civil War, largely consisted of using flags and things of that nature to communicate from one end of the Army to the other. But William Odie describes this event occurring on the morning of December 31st, 1862. They're not too far from General Polk's headquarters. And what's happening is a Confederate brigade is being formed up. The brigade was under the command of Daniel Donaldson, and they were getting ready to march off in one of the first attacks on the Round Forest. If you've been to Murfreesboro, that's where the Hazen Brigade Monument is located. But Lieutenant Odie describes that General Polk had sent his aide-de-camp, Lieutenant William Richmond, to Colonel Sidney Stanton of the newly organized 84th Tennessee, and he had orders for felt would obstruct the movement of his troops. Quote unquote, some words passed that led to blows, and though the bullets were flying thick and fast, here was seen the ludicrous spectacle of two officers engaged in a personal fight on the battlefield. Colonel Stanton had gotten Lieutenant Richmond's thumb in his mouth while Richmond was gnawing away at Stanton's ear. Finally, wiser counsel prevailed, and the interference of friends parted the belligerents, and they at once resumed their respective post of duty. Donaldson's brigade marched off a few minutes later in this assault on the Round Forest. There was one regiment of the brigade, however, that did not make the attack. Take a wild guess which one it was. It was the 84th Tennessee, because their colonel was now under arrest for assaulting a member of the general staff. So, and all this is going on as the bullets are flying and the shells are exploding. So, pretty chaotic situation. The next story I'm going to share with you was written by a Second Lieutenant David Franklin Embry. He was serving in the 42nd Indiana Infantry. He's writing this letter a couple of weeks after the battle. He's writing home to his sister. His sister, I think, was 14 years old at the time, but it was his closest sibling. Embry himself was 24, so he was a young man, but obviously very close with his sister. But he's describing, I'll just read it and you guys will, hopefully you have the same emotional impact it had on me. And he says, I noticed one case where the ball came obliquely from the left in front and passed several feet in front of me. It seemed that I could hear the ball singing almost from the time it left its bed in the rebel's gun, and as it swiftly came, I knew where it was going by the sound it made. This happened when we were not very hotly engaged and when our men were not firing, or else I could not have heard the singing of a single bullet. We were all kneeling among some brush, and suddenly I heard that same ball go crash, and I knew by the sound that it had burst a human skull. I barely had time to look around to my right, and then I saw Sergeant Chauncey Glassmith quivering and dying. Every one of us could not refrain from casting a glance at the dying man who lay there trembling in every limb, with blood spurting from his nostrils, from the wound in his forehead. In the heat of action, such seems not to affect one much, but it is awful indeed. As I'm thinking about this, obviously that he recorded this in such graphic detail, obviously it made quite the impression upon him, and he might have even been suffering from some what we would today call PTSD, and needed to share this with somebody. Obviously, his Army comrades would have been very familiar with the story. They were all there too, but he chose to share it with his sister, which I think just kind of gives some insight into how grisly and real this was for our Civil War ancestors. Another kind of feature of Hell by the Acre that makes it a little bit different than prior studies is there's a lot of focus, or a lot more focus, on the 10 medals of honor that were eventually awarded to men for their actions taken during the battle. It is worth noting that the first Medal of Honor for Stones River was not awarded until 1887, so 25 years after the battle. There were no Medals of Honor awarded during or shortly after the battle itself. They all happened many years later. But the final Medal of Honor for Stones River was awarded in 1902. Given that this is our nation's highest honor for our service personnel, I thought it was important to include a more full story of how they were awarded these medals and really what actions they took during the battle that later they earned that honor. So as you go through the book, you'll see the story of each of these 10 men. It's given a little bit of space and some room to breathe, so you can really understand and appreciate what their contributions were to winning the battle. It's a long list here, but this was probably for me the most exciting piece of writing this book. If you're familiar with any kind of Civil War writing, you know, most of the time us historians rely heavily on something called the OR, which is the official records of the War of the Rebellion. So the after action reports, the field communications that sometimes pass between commanders in Washington or even amongst the camp commanders themselves. But the real nuts and bolts of putting together a campaign history, you're generally relying on the OR, these official reports written by commanding officers for regiments and divisions and brigades that describe to you what happened. So they're reporting to their superiors what occurred on the battlefield. Well, when the OR was put together for the Stones River campaign, there was an entire division's worth of reports that for some reason were never included. The reports that were discovered all belonged to General Jones Withers' division, and there was only a half dozen divisions in the Confederate Army at this battle. So the fact that 1/6 of the Army we didn't have any after action reports from kind of made it hard to tell their story. I mean, of course, there's secondary literature, there's letters that the soldiers wrote, but you know the reports are usually considered a bit more authoritative when they were part of the OR. Well, back in the early 2000s, a gentleman named Lanny Smith discovered 33 of these missing reports in the General Braxton Bragg papers, which are at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. They were the original handwritten reports, written in pencil for the most part, but for whatever reason, they were never in the OR. And if you remember, Broadfoot published a supplement to the OR in the late 90s, which was, I don't know, 100 or 120 volumes, and it didn't make it into there either. Well, he discovered these reports, and obviously he was pretty excited when he found them, but he spent more than a year transcribing them all by hand because, they, as I said, they were in pencil. A lot of them were fairly faded. And he deserves all the credit in the world for discovering these and then publishing them. He put a 2-volume series about Stones River back in 2008 to 2010. Printed a very, very limited number of them, but one of the things he included in one of the appendices were all these missing Confederate reports. Lanny and I have been working and studying on Stones River for 20 plus years together. So when I kind of described the project to him, he readily agreed to let me use these to help write the narrative for Hell by the Acre. So I was really excited to be able to kind of use these for the first time to help tell the broader story of the battle. So what that does is, we now are able to kind of put voices to what before were just like, almost nameless regiments and units and whatnot. We're really able to put some meat on the bones. So the map that you're looking at is really of the core of the current Stones River battlefield in Murfreesboro. If you go there today, right around where it says Miller, That's essentially where tour stop number two is. Kind of amazingly, McFadden Lane is in the exact spot that it was during the battle. Wilkinson Pike, which you'll see on the bottom of the map, is still there. Doesn't quite get the traffic that some of the other roads do, but geographically, those locations are exactly the same place they were during the Civil War, which makes it a little easier for us to kind of place troop movements and things like that. As I said, what was exciting for me was once all of these missing after action reports were found, we were able to start studying and understanding a little better some of the different, especially the Confederate assaults that were made on the Union position here in the center earlier in the day. The first attack was actually made over on the right. You'll see a brigade of Mississippians called Chalmers. They made the first assault on the Round Force. Well, now we have after action reports for all of those units, which we did not have before. So we get some further insight into why that particular attack failed the way it did. Likewise, we also, all of the reports from Patton Anderson's brigade, which was one Alabama regiment and four Mississippi regiments, we were able to finally study and understand why that assault failed and failed as badly as it did. This is Lieutenant Colonel James Autry of the 27th Mississippi. He lost his life here. When you read in the book, you'll get a detailed account of how that happened and what the circumstances were. Likewise, this is an image of the couple of men from Company B, the 9th Mississippi Infantry. Obviously, this is a very early war picture because they're all in civilian garb. But we get a more of an intimate view about what their experiences were when they attacked the Round Forest. So, as I said, being able to use these reports helps us as historians reinterpret things that happen because we have a whole bunch of new sources to kind of put the story together. So that was personally very exciting for me. That said, a historian once noted about Stones River that few battles ever cost more or meant less. And I think it might have been Bruce Catton that wrote that back in the 1960s. And I can, for part of me, I can kind of understand why he'd say that. There was enormous casualties. There wasn't a lot of ground that changed hands. It was almost in a lot of ways like Chancellorsville. The two armies, bludgeoned each other for several days and then kind of went back to their respective camps. Stones River was a federal victory. It was a federal victory by the narrowest of margins. The Federal Army came within a hair's breadth of losing this battle on two occasions. First on December 2nd, and then again during Bragg's night assault on January 2nd. It was only by some very hard fighting and some good luck that the Federal Army was able to hold on to their ground. But they did, and that said, Stones River is considered a federal victory. I disagree wholeheartedly that few battles meant less. Stones River actually meant a great deal, but its importance lies in the context in which it occurred. Remember, this is at the end of 1862, beginning of 1863. The Federal Army at Fredericksburg had been defeated in the first half of December, probably the most discouraging defeat of the Army of Potomac's existence. A lot of folks don't remember this, but General Grant was active in Mississippi at the time. He was trying to capture Vicksburg, and actually had two different, we'll call them two different expeditions that were moving into Mississippi. There was a land expedition that he was leading that was in more northern Mississippi, and then there was a riverborne expedition that Tecumseh Sherman led that kind of came to naught at a place called Chickasaw Bayou. So they had tried to they landed north of Vicksburg on the Yazoo River and then tried to march south and take Vicksburg from the rear, but they ran into Confederate defenses and suffered a very bloody repulse. So that said, Grant's invasion of Mississippi has come to naught. It's essentially a defeat. Chickasaw Bayou especially. Fredericksburg is a defeat. What if defeated Stones River had followed? What impact would that have had on the Union war effort? Where does that leave the Union cause? I mean, we already know at the end of 1862, war weariness is definitely becoming an issue. The fall elections had largely fallen to the Democrats, and that year kind of as a sign of, we'll say, displeasure with the Lincoln administration's conduct of the war. There was a lot of unease in the North about the Emancipation Proclamation and kind of the change of direction that signaled. How does all that? What if the federal armies are being defeated across the board? What impact does that have on not only the cause but on the Emancipation Proclamation itself? I think one of Lincoln's cabinet members had cautioned him against, releasing this emancipation earlier in the war because he didn't want it to look like, quote unquote, the last shriek on the retreat. Well, if the federal armies are being defeated across the country, is this not almost a last shriek on the retreat kind of thing? And more practically, if the federal armies are not being successful, who's going to believe in the Emancipation Proclamation at all? I mean, it didn't really free any slaves. It simply said they could take the opportunity and they'd be welcomed within federal lines. Well, if they perceive that the federal army is going to lose the war, would anyone take advantage of it? The last piece that where I think is Stones River is important was one of the major concerns that Lincoln had at this time was worry that the British would recognize the Confederacy. Late in the year, Rosecrans and General Halleck, who was the chief of staff and basically the senior military officer in Washington, got into a bit of a war of telegrams because Halleck's pushing Rosecrans to move sooner than Rosecrans was ready. And finally, Halleck confesses, well, part of the reason I'm pushing you so hard is because the president's concerned that when Parliament goes into session in January, if they perceive that the federal army has lost ground, they may be incentivized to go ahead and intervene on the side of the South or come up, force a negotiated settlement, and he wanted to avoid that. So that was very much an important consideration on Lincoln's mind. And Stones River being a federal victory did give some teeth to the Emancipation Proclamation. It kind of saved the Union cause at really its lowest point. And as we all know, the English, for other reasons other than just Stones River, but they ultimately never recognized the Confederacy. President Lincoln had a few things to say about Stones River. He wrote this to Rosecrans several months later. And thinking of how important this victory was to the Union cause, he says, I can never forget, whilst I remember anything, that you gave us a hard-earned victory, which had there been a defeat instead, the nation could scarcely have lived over. I think that's how dire he considered the situation at the end of 1862. So the victory at Stones River helped carry the federal cause really through its darkest hour. And in that case, I think it's a lot more important than it's been given credit for. One of the last things I want to leave you tonight is I want to talk something that's near and dear to my heart, which is the case for preservation. Stones River was an enormous battlefield. It would almost rival, if the original battlefield had been preserved, it would rival the Chickamauga National Battlefield Park in size. So if any of you have ever been there, you understand what a substantial piece of property that was. Unfortunately, that did not happen at Murfreesboro. The Stones River National Battlefield did not, even the first portions were not preserved until 1927. And then even then it was at best 20% of the entire battlefield that was preserved. Now it has grown a little bit since that time. I think it's now up to about 700 acres, but that is spread out across a number of different sites. But Murfreesboro itself is a rapidly growing community. I think the first time I went there was about 2001, and it might have been a town of 75 or 80,000 people. I mean, it was a good size town, but nothing like it is today. You go there today, I think it's pushing 200,000 residents, and of course all the development that occurs when you have a lot of people moving in. Lots of gas stations, there's apartment complexes, housing developments all over the place. So a lot of the battlefield has been developed really in the last 10 to 15 years. But there are still some portions that are left, so we're not out of time quite yet. So what I've got circled here, this is the core of the current Stones River National Battlefield Park. The park entrance is up, it'd be in the upper right-hand side there where it says Stones River National Cemetery. That's right across from the visitor center. There's several roads that take you back into the park. But this is like the largest contiguous piece of land not connected. But as I said, there are opportunities for preservation. Directly west of the park, there's this huge open space tucked in between two neighborhoods. Last time I checked, it was a combination horse farm and event center that a local family owns. So that said, there's a large chunk of the battlefield that has not yet been developed. Now, someone might ask, well, that's nice. Did anything actually happen there worth preserving? Well, as a matter of fact, quite a bit. So this is an overlay of the map that's included in Held by the Acre. And you might remember earlier in the presentation, we saw Colonel Sam Beatty's brigade going into action. This is where that occurred. This ground is where that occurred. And there was some of the hardest fighting of the battle was fought on this apparently empty plot of land at Stones River. So there are still opportunities to preserve important battlefield land at Stones River. I would offer most of them are the land is mostly located west and or north of the current park boundaries. But with the pace of development at Stones River, if we don't act soon, there will be construction on most of this property. And as we've learned in Franklin, you can resuscitate ground after it's been developed, but it is enormously costly. Any preservation at Stones River will also be very costly. Land prices and land values in Tennessee are quite high. As I said, it's rapidly growing. So there's work to be done at Stones River, but there's also opportunity. And I hope the presentation tonight helps you understand a little bit about why this battle was important and why it's important that we do preserve some more land at Stones River. Not necessarily just for ourselves, but for our grandchildren as well to enjoy and interpret this important part of our nation's history. That said, I'm going to make my hard commercial pitch. I do have some books available for sale tonight. I've got a few copies left of Held by the Acre. I did a follow-on book that came out in April called Faces of Stones River. But those are both available for purchase here tonight, as well as a few of my other titles. Held by the Acre was awarded the Richard B. Harwell Award from the Atlanta Civil War Roundtable. It's the best Civil War book of 2024. Ken obviously enjoyed it, so thank you very much for the plug. But with that said, I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.